Now, this is a video that I want to address, for any Sonic collectors out there who want to know the definitive scaling on the Sonic characters. So, I found a photo that was taken from a book. I'm not so sure what book it is, but let me know down in the comments below if you know what book that this came from. And basically, it shows all the characters in their height requirements. Just ignore almost every character and just take a look at the major characters: Amy, Tails, Knuckles, and Sonic. You can see that they have a distinct scaling height difference. Tails is the shortest. He is shorter than Amy, who is shorter than Sonic and is shorter than Knuckles, leaving Tails to be the shortest and Knuckles to be the tallest. So basically, it goes from Tails, Amy, Sonic, and Knuckles, from shortest to tallest. And you can definitely see how toy companies don't really do it that much in terms of, making the action figures of the main four heroes. Resaurus is one of the only companies that did the scaling thing, much better than most companies, at the time and nowadays. You could see that Sonic is correctly taller than Tails, even though Tails isn't this tall compared to the others. He is still accurately short, even if I think he should be as short as, say, 3.5 inches, since the Resource figures are around the 4-inch height. And Knuckles is correctly much taller than Sonic, so even though they don't really do a 100% accurate job at scaling, you can see that they did the scaling thing really decently. And even though Amy is not in this photo, I did took a snapshot of Wake Angel 2001's video on the Amy figure. Sonic seems to be a lot taller than Amy, which is really, canonically, they did a really well done job at, scaling it. Even though Toy Island did not made an Amy in the figures with accessories line from their Sonic Adventure line, they did at least made 3 of the 4 major characters: Tails, Sonic, and Knuckles. And you can see that, these are pretty ugly figures. Well, except for Knuckles. I think Knuckles is pretty decent, but Tails and Sonic are not really that great looking. And their scaling might seem to be a little off, though maybe the scaling might be accurate if they were standing straight up. The problem is that it's hard to tell on the correct scaling, because all these figures are bending their legs. Knuckles is really squatting. Now the Sonics in the Sonic X Megabot line, they seem to be a bit too tall if they were standing straight up. I mean, them just being bent down, it looks fine, but if they were standing straight up, he might be maybe as tall, maybe even taller than say Shadow or something. And also, not to mention that Knuckles may be around the same height as Tails if you count Tails' ears. And even though he looks good, he doesn't seem to be that well scaled. And Amy, she just looks a lot smaller in comparison to Tails. I'd say Amy works well with Knuckles, but Sonic and Tails, not so much. Even though they didn't fix the scaling issue on Tails and Amy and Sonic, they did correctly try to make Knuckles taller, and even though he looks like a downgrade compared to the previous one, he is much better in terms of scaling. The last Toy Island example that I'm going to be talking to you about is the bendable figures from their Sonic Adventure and Sonic X line. Now you can see that for the most part, they're approximately the same height, though there are some slight differences. Amy is correctly shorter than Sonic, and Sonic is correctly shorter than Knuckles, but the problem is Tails. Tails seems to be a bit too tall, and that is the problem. Basically, the scaling is actually a lot better than most of the Toy Islands' previous, or their sublines, but they kind of seem to get it right on the bendable figures for the most part. It's just that Tails just seems a bit too big. Now let's move on from Toy Island and talk about everyone's favorite Sonic the Hedgehog toy line, though to me it's not a personal favorite of mine. I don't really like them a lot. They're mediocre, to say the least. But it is the Sonic the Hedgehog line from Jazwares, and boy, let's talk about the scaling. I don't know what, but for the most part, their scaling is pretty good. It's just a couple characters are just not well scaled with other characters. Like, for example, Knuckles is around Sonic's height, and that is not to be the case because if they were to properly scale Knuckles, he probably would be 3¼ inches. Same goes for Tails. Tails should have been, like, maybe 2¾ inches or 2½ inches. I don't know. And not to mention how the joints on the older ones kind of just makes them look inaccurate. I don't know. There just seems to be something wrong about them. So yeah, so Sonic doesn't really seem to scale well with Knuckles and Tails, but he does really scale well with Amy. The Sonic and Amy scale is really good. Amy is correctly shorter than Sonic, though not by a long shot. And I really appreciate how Jazwares did at least attempted, to properly scale their figures, since they do kind of get a reputation for not scaling their figures well, even if it's not the 3-inch line. Now, we need to talk about the Jazwares Tails figure, and why, in my opinion, he is one of the worst figures from the 3-inch line. Not only does he have the inaccurate old joints, and not to mention the waist joint kind of just lines up with the chest fur pretty incorrectly if you move it, but also his color. His color is pretty inaccurate. I mean, it's a shade of orange. It's more of an orange, even though Tails should be more of a yellow. And Jazwares, the good news is that in the 2013 release of him with his accessory, they did give him the newer joints, which makes him look much more accurate. But the problem is that his orange color is a lot darker, making him more of a brown on some of the photos. But there is a very obscure release, like around the time when Jazwares Sonic is like ending soon, and he's in like a white box. It's a single pack, and they actually corrected his yellow color. And not to mention that he has the new joints. So if you removed the top of the legs, you can actually get an accurately sized Tails. And this is proof from this one photo from a DeviantArt user who did the same thing. And wow, it looks much better. For comparison, here's another picture from the same DeviantArt user using some of his custom figures and official figures. And you can see that scale is really good, and I kind of wish Jazwares kind of did that in the first place. Again, taking some photos from Wake Angel 2001's video, the Silver Superposer review. Now we're going to talk about the scaling on the Superposer figures from both Toy Island and Jazwares, and if I'm not mistaken, Sonic, Silver, and Shadow should be the same height. Like, judging by the height chart, I'm pretty sure that is the case. Like, only counting the heads, not their spines. And I think Jazwares did that. I think they accurately scaled both Sonic, Shadow, and to some extent, Silver. Now, Tails is also correctly shorter than Sonic, Silver, and Shadow. But the problem is that Knuckles is not correctly taller than Sonic, Shadow, and Silver. So yeah, it's pretty inconsistent. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there was like more Jazwares Sonic inconsistencies, because there are tons of Jazwares Sonic inconsistencies. I can list them all if you want. Now we're on to the Tomy Sonic line, the collector series, and basically Tomy is also one of the only companies that did the scaling right. You can see that Tails is shorter than Sonic, and Sonic is shorter than Knuckles, and that is actually accurate. A lot of people complain that Tails may be too short, but that's not only just because his legs, both legs are bent down, but also because it's actually accurate to the chart. And not to mention that there's the screenshot from the OKKO Sonic crossover where Tails is depicted as a similar height as the Tomy Tails figure. Unfortunately, the Amy figure was not released, even though we already assumed that at the toy fair, the prototype figure was in scale with the others. But the Jazwares Amy is good in scale with the Tomy figures, and that's a good thing. Last up, I want to talk about the bendable figures from Jakks Pacific. Now, the scaling of Shadow and Sonic are really good, But Knuckles, I'm not really too sure about it. He could be the same height as Sonic, if not maybe even a tad bit taller, which is right, but Tails not so much. It's like they've just like doubled his size and just like called it a day. I think Tails should have been a 3.5-inch figure. I mean, all these figures, well, most of them are in the 4-inch height. Now, in the second wave, we have Metal Sonic and Super Sonic, and they're all going to be in the same height as Sonic and Shadow, so that kind of tells you that size is pretty accurate. Now, Eggman, now I haven't talked about Eggman's height, but as you could clearly see in the height chart, he's very big, probably like a 6-inch figure, and the only figure that would be a great scale with the Jakks figures are the Toy Island Eggman figure, which is a really great figure in my opinion. This Jakks one doesn't look too bad. I mean, he looks really great, and they did try to make him taller, but the problem is that he's not tall enough, and that is a problem. So hopefully by the next couple waves, Jakks Pacific does a better job scaling their Sonic figures, and hopefully they make an Amy, because I would love for them to make an Amy on the third wave. So that is all I wanted to talk about for this video. I just wanted to address this so that way people know about the official canon heights of the Sonic characters. Thanks for watching.